very brief. So our guest this evening is Dr. Brendan Buckley of East Hardwick, who will discuss his new book, The Morse Code, Legacy of a Vermont Sportswriter. Dr. Buckley, as you all know, I think, is a graduate of Middlebury College class of 1973 or 4, depending on whether you're talking to the alumni office or looking at his diploma. After a few years of teaching school after college, Dr. Buckley decided to, not yet Dr. Buckley decided to pursue a career in medicine and ultimately passed that career serving in the community of Hardwick. He has since retired but remains in the kingdom with his wife Helen, and she is a retired school psychologist. So with that, welcome to Brendan Buckley.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Renee. Thank you for coming this evening. Did anyone here know Dave?
Yes.
You did?
Yeah.
From when or?
65 to 69.
Okay. Rutland Herald years?
Yes, Rutland Herald.
Okay,
Absolutely.
great. So tonight I'll share what inspired me to write the story and then some tales from developing the story. It involved hours and hours in archives and newspaper offices and town clerk offices. And along the way, I did stumble across this one little gem from September 1972, prospects for the Middlebury College soccer season. I'm not the only one in this room whose name is in this story, but I'm the only one whose name is misspelled. but it's by Dave, so somewhere in the past our paths had crossed that I hadn't realized until I went on this journey. But here's the Dave that I came to know. This is, other than the coat and tie, this is where Dave was and what he looked like most of the time, with his little notepad and pen at hand. He arrived in Hardwick in 1994, and it was shortly after that our children started to become involved in various sports, and Dave was always there, and it's hard to miss that face. And I was intrigued to go and chat with him and learn a little bit about him, and that was a conversation that went on over the next 20 years, mostly on the sidelines of various sporting events. But this is on the occasion of the Dave Morse Appreciation Night held in February 2014 at Hazen Union High School Auditorium. It was pretty packed on a February night. Dave was there under the guise that there was going to be a basketball team meeting, and they wanted to thank him for just covering the team through the season. But in fact, it was really a time when people from all around several communities that the Hardwick Gazette covered could be there to thank Dave for how important they saw him as a figure in the community. This picture was taken by Vanessa Fournier, who was the primary Hardwick Gazette photographer, and they worked together over most of those 20 years, and this was her favorite picture of Dave. I was one of the speakers that evening to thank Dave, and in the few minutes I talked, I encouraged him to write a book, because I knew just from my conversations that this man was a treasure trove of Vermont sports lore and history and stories. It would have been a wonderful read. Nobody that evening knew that within a little over a year Dave would die. He was hale and hearty that evening, and as you'll see in a moment. But sometime in those next 12 to 14 months, it occurred to me that I really wanted to tell his story. And that was going to be a very different book than the one Dave would write. The one Dave would write would not talk about Dave at all. It would talk about Vermont sports history. And I really felt that a light needed to shine on Dave. The reason for that, as I put in my title, the Morse Code. The Morse Code was the column that Dave wrote every week in the Hardwick Gazette, in addition to, the 6 or 8 other stories he wrote covering various sports events. He just had his own column where he could digress and talk about other sports issues in the news, or some old history that he recalled, or people that he'd encountered. But this was a message that he wrote on the occasion of Hazen Union High School dedicating their yearbook to him in 2006. And I hope my message is clear, show respect of young people in particular, and it will come back to serve you well, be part of their lives every day. Additionally, he had said that he loved to shine a light on the kids. And I would add that he believed in the power of community, as was evidenced by all the people in the room on his appreciation night, and also very much in paying it forward. And you'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. Let me just share for you the opening of the book describing that evening at Hazen. On a raw northern Vermont night in February 2014, more than 200 sports fans headed out into the weather. They left behind their TVs, which offered highlights of the Olympic Games in Sochi and the number 8 Duke men's basketball team grinding out a 69-67 win over Maryland. Instead, the fans gathered in the Hazen Union School Auditorium in Hardwick, Vermont. Aaron Hill, coach of the boys' high school basketball team, had organized the occasion. He'd invited Dave Morse, sports writer and editor for the local weekly, the Hardwick Gazette, to a team gathering, ostensibly to thank Dave for his coverage of the team, and particularly for his efforts to acknowledge the contributions of every player throughout the season. In truth, the event had been planned to give area athletes across all sports and their families an opportunity to express their thanks to a man whose mission over the previous 20 years had been, in his words, to shine a light on the kids. Dave's beat at the Gazette spanned as many as 10 towns, none larger than 3,000 people. The towns are tucked in the hills around and along the Lamoille River Valley. Many are connected by meandering, sketchily paved, or dirt roads. A one-man sports department, Dave covered a dizzying array of events across the region. A search of the Gazette archives yields stories covering the typical cross-section of school sports, from elementary to college. Beyond the playing fields of academe, Dave covered youth leagues, wiffle ball contests, summer soccer and softball games, and snowmobile races. Farther afield, he reported from Thunder Road, a stock car racetrack in Barrie, from the Craftsbury Outdoor Center, breeding ground for national and Olympic level scullers and Nordic skiers, and from Montpelier, where the Vermont Mountaineers, a collegiate league baseball team, summered. He drove to the top of the Appalachian Gap in the Green Mountains to witness a local cyclist compete. It was not unusual for him to travel to Dartmouth College, the University of Vermont, or other state colleges to follow homegrown athletes as they competed at the next level. One of the speakers that night was a man named Billy Waller, who's now coaching in Virgins, but he had coached Cabot School near Hardwick in both basketball and soccer. And he told a couple of stories that evening that I will give you a picture of what Dave meant to the community. The first story was about a midwinter basketball game between Cabot and Craftsbury, separated by about 20 miles of winding hilly roads in the middle of a bad snowstorm. And Billy said he was hoping the bus driver would turn around. He was not excited about the drive, but the driver sort of took it on as a challenge, was sure that they'd make it. The typical parade of parents' cars was not behind the bus that night, it was just the bus. They arrived at Craftsbury, little old dingy, low-ceiling gymnasium. And Billy said there were no cars in front of the gym, there were just 3 snow machines. They went into the gym. The Craftsbury team was 6 players and a coach. The coach was the father of 3 of the 6 kids. There was nobody in the stands except Dave. And Billy was somewhat appalled and surprised that Dave was there. The game's played. It actually turns out to be a great game. Last second shot to win it. Cabot wins. They go home, and Billy calls Dave the next day to make sure he made it home safely. And the following week in the Hardwick Gazette, Dave's article talks about the roar of the crowd. And the other story was when Billy went to visit a student whom he had coached a few years before, who had since graduated from the school, was still living at home. It was a home in a family that struggled to make ends meet. And Billy went in and was just aware that the walls were empty of any decor, and pretty meager circumstances. But on the refrigerator were magnetized Dave Morse clippings with their son's name highlighted. And their son had not started for Billy. He'd just been on the bench. But Dave just went out of his way to write about every kid that he could, and to shine a light on that kid. So I want to just give you a moment of Dave. This is him thanking the crowd the night of his appreciation night. Dave speaks as he writes. You can't always follow where he's going. You kind of have to be in sync with him. He'll talk about Vanessa thanking his photographer. He'll talk about a young man named Tristan Southworth, was a Hazen athlete that he became very close to, who died in Afghanistan. He talks about the Hazen Wildcats, which mostly is about their basketball team because they won several state championships in the years that Dave was there. But it'll give you a good idea of who Dave was.
I had planned on saying a few things. I actually know everyone here. It's the greatest feeling of my life to come into this building and see Timmy Shed. Everybody else see Tristan Southworth's family. I would be remiss in not crediting Vanessa for the photo she takes to make the copy look better. I did jot a few notes down, but I have mentioned Aaron a couple of times. Yes, it's been 20 years, early February, early this month, because Aaron keeps track of those things. That's how important this is to this community. And if I ever made a good decision in my life, it was coming to Hardwick. I mean that with all my heart. I was born in Morrisville. You believe that?
Home to People's Academy, which was Hazen's big rival.
My first newspaper job was the Times-Argus with the great Henry Gilbert. I worked with Ken Squire. I covered those great Spalding teams that you sometimes hear about, even if it was 1962, 3 or 4 or something like that. This outsurpasses anything, and I could get Frederickson to say that. He won 5. We don't figure to ever lose. A good day, yeah, you're going to get beat a couple times, but you're going to come back the next day and win. And that's what these young people are all about. Just to look, and you know, I just caught Ryan Howell. Coach Hill was asking me about great things that have happened. Remember his shot against Williamstown in the Tristan Southworth game? That's what this town is all about. People coming out, sharing. No, I'm not going to write a Morse code about this. but for Brittany to do what she did, because we all know, and the quote from Trav is so important. Everybody's in this together. Always have been, always will be. Waller was the same way at Cabot. Those guys tore the roof off the auditorium. That has to be shown around town at special gatherings, because that's what this town is all about, always will be about. I did try to make some notes to start with. I'm glad I didn't bring anything from home, just because this is a singular moment to me, and to see the present day Bobcats here, they're gonna keep coming. We saw one earlier tonight, and Betty too. But yeah, once a wildcat, always a wildcat. And please, always remember the sacrifices and say a prayer for Tristan. Thank you.
So when I set out on this project, I thought it would be fairly straightforward, that I would go and speak with Dave's family, who could fill me in on his childhood, then find people who would work with Dave prior to his years in Hardwick, and then I had a pretty good handle on the 20 years in Hardwick, in addition to just tapping into resources around town and around the community. And my first interview was with Dave's sister Deanna, who was third of the 4 children. And she fairly quickly disabused me that this was going to be simple. When she told me that she'd been separated from Dave for much of their childhood, and that B, quote, we lost Dave for a few years, referring to a time in the 70s and 1980s when Dave just was totally out of touch with friends and family. So to give you a little bio, this is Dave on the right. He's probably 7 or 8. It's probably shortly after World War II. That's the next in line, Don next to him. This was in a framed picture in Deanna's apartment. This was one half, and the other half was Deanna and the younger brother, Dex, similarly outfitted for the snow in the same location. And Deanna remembered this as the only time in their lives that the family of 6 were together. Their father was a farmhand on a dairy farm in Waitsfield, but he was a pretty unreliable parent, alcohol continually interfering with his ability to hold down a job. He was a philanderer. Their mom worked at what is now the Brattleboro Retreat, so that involved train rides from Waterbury down to Brattleboro for some number of days each week and then coming home. So for much of their childhood, they were farmed out to relatives in Waterbury and Morrisville, and rarely with all 4 kids together. And in the more challenging times, they were actually put into foster homes. So there were great chunks of time that they really weren't together. Dave's mom contracted TB and died when Dave was about 10. Deanna's description of that last year of their mother's life is very reminiscent of COVID, in that they would visit her at the sanatorium in Barry, which was mostly for people with stone dust disease, but also for patients with tuberculosis. But they couldn't go in, so they stood outside and waved in the window to their mom over their visits the last year of her life. But ironically, after she died, the family rallied to try and make more stable homes for the 4 kids. So that Dave and Don went to the paternal uncle Rex and his wife Emma in Waterbury, and the two younger kids went to the maternal grandparents in Morrisville. So they would see each other occasionally on weekends, but not with any real regularity. But it finally gave Dave a stable living situation, and I think really began to set for him a foundation for the code that he followed through life. And he just had some mentors finally. So the first was Rex, who was the older brother to David's father, World War II hero, upstanding member of the community. The Waterbury Armory actually bears his name to this day. He had founded the Waterbury Regiment. He and Rex in turn enabled Dave to go to Camp Abnaki in North Hero, Vermont every summer, starting at about age 12 or 13. And Camp Abnaki is on this gorgeous spot. It's still there in North Hero, a beautiful piece of land. And it was run by a man named Clyde Hess. And his mission was really to de-emphasize any sense of competition. And the motto of the camp was, look out for the other fellow. And Dave spent years as a camper, then subsequently as a counselor, and actually after high school went further into the administration of the camp, to people describing him to me as Clyde Hess's right-hand man. So that was probably over 10 or 12 years, consecutive summers that Dave was doing that. And then the other mentor was Dak Rowe, another well-known name in Waterbury. The recreational fields there bear his name. He was a World War I veteran who was the principal at Waterbury High School from the late 1920s until well after Dave graduated in the mid-1950s. And he was this iconic, upstanding figure that when Dave would write about him in articles years later, he still referred to him as Mr. Rowe. But Dak Rowe was a coach of the cross-country team and the basketball team. And the cross-country team in Waterbury, Vermont in the early 1950s were New England champions. And so you might imagine that it was a magnet for kids to try out for the team. Dave was one of the ones to try out for the team, and he described the tryout as, I took a wrong turn, literally took a wrong turn. And so Dak Rowe said, you're my manager. So he recognized this is a guy who loves sports. He's not very good at them, but we're going to keep him involved and give him something to do. And so in that role, Dave was looking after the team, but also calling up the radio stations and the newspapers after the game and filing a report, and perhaps just starting to get the feel of what it might be like to be a sports reporter. And so as he emerged from Waterbury, late 1950s, early 1960s, I think he finally had a foundation in terms of just a moral code, a professional pathway, and very sadly, some emotional scars from his childhood that I don't think he ever really fully recovered from. So here's the house that Rex and Emma owned. It's on Main Street in Waterbury, just across from the town offices. This is Camp Abnaki website, obviously today, not in 1950, but they still have the same motto, help the other fellow. This is Dave, his high school senior yearbook, a little different from the man I knew. There he is on the back right. His first job was as a WDEV administrator at the radio station, but he eventually got some on-air time with a noonday sports report. And from there, he went on to the Times-Argus, and he mentioned in his little speech working for Henry Juris, who was long-standing sports editor at the Times-Argus through those years, and he credited Henry with really helping him transition to written journalism. And pretty quickly, he was at the Times-Argus over 2 or 3 years. He went to Springfield for a year as their sports editor, and then at age 29 was hired by the Rutland Herald as their sports editor, which is a fairly remarkable ascension from where he came. I spoke with many of his colleagues at the Rutland Herald in those years who really felt it was the best little small-town newspaper in America. That's a hard argument to take one side of or the other, but they had a good point in that alumni from that era went to the New Yorker, went to Newsday on Long Island, went out to St. Louis. Howard Coffin went to work on Capitol Hill for Vermont legislators. So it was clearly a good group of people that Dave was in the midst of, but at a very young age was already heading that up. Before you go any further, this is a story from the Times-Argus in 1962. And remember this name, Ken Burnham. So while Dave was at the Times-Argus covering that Spalding basketball team he talked about, they won 4 state championships in a row. But a little 25 miles to the north, Hardwick Academy was smaller scale, also producing some pretty good athletic results. And Ken Burnham and Dave will cross paths again one day.
Ray Pankowski, any relation to David? You're coming to that.
So,
Sorry.
yeah, there's some Middlebury folks here in the audience, college. So Ray was Dave's older brother, star pitcher, and this pitching duel between he and John Dimmick, actually won by Dimmick, was legendary, certainly in Hardwick over the years. I've had many emails with Ray and Dave about this, but John Dimmick actually went on to be offered a pro job, which, long story, his father turned down. But John played for the American Legion team in Barrie, and their big rival for the state title every summer was Bellows Falls with a guy named Pudge Fisk. So Dave was covering Pudge Fisk at an early age, or an early time in his career. So as he arrives in Rutland, a couple of things are happening. First, he's really established his professional career. And secondly, he sorry here. So I had a meeting in January of 2016 after Dave had died. I was doing medical coverage at the Craftsbury Outdoor Center for one of their races. And this man walks in to the general offices that clearly everybody else there knew that I didn't know. And they're gabbing with him about ski results and so on and so forth. And then he says, "Anybody here know Dave Morse?" And my ears perked up. And I said, yes, I did, but he had died the year before. And flashback 20 years before that, the Outdoor Center had hosted the NCAA ski race championships because they'd been bumped from traps due to lack of snow. And that was fairly early on in Dave's time at the Hardwick Gazette. But he was up there covering these events. And I remember going up to watch just for fun and seeing Dave running around with his little notepad and musing to myself that this was just a little small town sports reporter who covered basketball and soccer, but had never really been to a ski race before. So now here we are in 2016, and this man says, "Anyone know Dave Morse?" And I tell him I do. And he just says, "That man did more for Nordic skiing in Vermont than anybody else." And I just went, what? Anyway, that man was Peter Graves. Peter grew up in Bennington in the early 1960s, and he would cross Route 9 to go over to Putney School, where John Caldwell was starting to really develop Nordic skiing in Vermont, and in many ways in the United States. And Peter became part of that and became a good Nordic performer, ski jumper more than racer. He went out west to school. When he graduated, he parlayed his athletic abilities and connections into becoming an announcer for television Nordic events and becoming a PA announcer for these big events such as Craftsbury held that weekend that I met him. So when the Olympics were at Lake Placid, Peter Graves was the guy out at the ski jump that they would talk to about, was that a good jump or a bad jump, and so on. So I finally interviewed Peter a couple of years later just to hear his stories about Dave. And tears ran down his face as he talked about how important Dave was. And I'll just read to you some of what he said to me. He talked about encountering Dave a couple of years before Dave died at a sports banquet in Montpelier. And he sat down at a table, and there was this older man there, and Peter introduced himself, and the man said, "I know who you are. I'm Dave Morse. I used to write about you." Says Peter, "It was a powerful moment. He was a hero of mine. I got up and gave him a hug. I remembered a quote from my ski coach, 'Peter, your heart is smiling.' It was true that night. I said to Dave, 'You did so much, and here tonight maybe not everybody remembers, but I remember, and thank you.' That was very, very powerful because I didn't know if I would see this guy again. That was very important to me." Graves cried as he recalled Dave's coverage of Nordic skiing during those heady days in southern Vermont as Caldwell nurtured a growing force of top athletes. If you were anywhere in southern Vermont, you read the Herald. It was a prestigious family-owned newspaper. It became a regular go-to for this high school kid, and that was driven by the coverage of Dave. He cared about the athletes. He cared about the words he chose. He tried to put the best possible face on American cross-country skiing. I was an early fan of Dave Morse long before I ever met him. So there's Dave as a significant figure in the development of Nordic skiing. He'd covered Pudge Fisk, he'd covered Spalding, he had helped build Thunder Road, the stock car racetrack in Barrie. So he clearly had established his credentials. In 1968, he was the only Vermont sportswriter to go to Grenoble and cover the Vermont kids who were on that Olympic team. At the same time, and there was another important event in his life. But first, for anyone who's not yet read the book, we have a pop quiz. Howard Coffin, who worked with Dave at the Herald, described to me an event one winter night where Dave burst into the Herald offices and just announced breathlessly, "I've just seen the best basketball player ever to play in the state of Vermont." And Howard Coffin recalls saying, "Well, Dave, you know, the Celtics have played some exhibition games here, so Russell, Cousy, Havlicek, really, you've just seen the best?" And Dave said, "Absolutely, this is the best basketball player ever to play in Vermont." Any ideas who?
At St. J.
Dr. J, who was playing for UMass in Burlington against UVM. So maybe Dave was right, I don't know. Again, not a debate for me to get into. So Dave met Marietta Munlin. Her maiden name was Burns. She was a performer, just went by one name, Marietta. She was a traveling singer and had a regular gig at the Bardwell Hotel in downtown Rutland, where journalists would often go at the end of the day. And Dave was smitten. It's not clear exactly when they met. It may have been as early as sometime in the 60s. But in late 1973, they married. And the marriage lasted not quite a year, and Marietta left. And Ted Ryan was the other sports writer at the Rutland Herald at that time. He and Dave were kind of a two-man tag team. And there was no Sunday edition of the paper. So Sunday night, all the weekend sports was being put together for the Monday morning paper, and they would just take turns doing the Sunday nights. And Ted was home and got a call one fall night in 1974 asking, so who's putting the sports together for tomorrow's paper? And Ted said, oh, Dave's got it. And they said, no, it's dark over there. Dave's not here. And Ted said, oh, Dave just forgot. I'll go do it. So he went in, put it together. Monday, no Dave. Tuesday, no Dave. Wednesday, no Dave. And Dave had disappeared. And literally, by many people there, never to be seen again over the next 20 years. And so that was the other mystery that landed in my lap. And so I worked to try and just track down more about Marietta, and of course to see if I could find out what happened to Dave over that period of time. Maine was central to the story of what might have happened to Dave, because Dave had gone to Bowdoin to cover a Middlebury football game and had expressed excitement that he was going to go over and Marietta was performing there so that he'd see her. And he came back from that game, and it was within the next 8 or 10 days that he disappeared. So I found the wedding certificate. I learned that she was from Wyoming, Ohio, which is a little suburb outside of Cincinnati. I reached out to the Wyoming Historical Society, found a wonderful woman named Sherry Sheffield. I think historical societies generally have wonderful people who are so excited to dive into a project. So she was wonderful. She really gave me some good tools to research and to seek. I then started calling town clerk's offices in and around Brunswick to see if I could find a divorce decree. And the fourth or fifth town clerk's office that I called, this woman just said, well, hold on a minute, and clunks down the phone and shuffles off, and I wait a couple minutes and I hear her coming back, and she picks up the phone and says, well, that was a needle in a haystack. But she had found the divorce document, so that I knew that at least that's where Marietta was, and I went over there and found her obituary. She had died in the late 1980s. She had remarried. And in the obituary, it mentioned that she had 2 sons. So I came home and went to Helen, my wife, and asked her to go on her Facebook account and put in the names of these people in Cincinnati to see does something pop up. And indeed, it did. Will Munlin popped up, and I emailed him through Helen's Facebook and just said, are you Marietta's son? And at some time later, not soon enough for me, but eventually, this reply came back. She was my grandmother. And so I'm sure he thought I was a stalker because I said, well, it just so happens I'm traveling cross country. Would it be okay if I stopped in? And my friend Eric and I were driving cross country, and we stopped in. And this is Will Munlin Jr. on the left with his mother. So it's his mom who would have married one of Marietta's 2 sons. And we spent an hour or so there visiting. Will was actually a good enough baseball player that around the turn of the century he was playing in the Cape Cod League. And if Dave had known that Marietta's grandson was playing baseball in the Cape Cod League, he would have been there in a heartbeat. And that's Marietta's gravestone in Bath, Maine, with some musical notes at the top. As poorly as we might think of Marietta and suddenly leaving Dave after such a brief marriage, a stepdaughter of hers from Maine spoke very highly of her as this wonderful, gifted, talented woman who would sing and play the piano and was a wonderful seamstress. So I'm not sure we'll ever know exactly what went on between Marietta and Dave or what she was thinking when she deserted Dave.
Brandon, where is she buried?
In Bath.
Can you help me with the chronology between when the marriage split up and when Dave disappeared?
Days.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so I think probably on that trip to Brunswick, she told him that she was done, and he came back and he wasn't able to hold it together. And that was pretty, and I think, I write in the book, I think these scars go back to his childhood and losing his mom. And there are other instances before this time and even in his time in Hardwick where he just would disappear when things were difficult. And he always expressed to his sister Deanna just this sense of shame that he was unable to keep a marriage together. So where Dave went, it's difficult for me to tell you. I looked and looked and looked, and I have a chapter that sees him in little bits and pieces over those 20 years. But it really was about a 20-year stretch of time that it's not clear really where he was living, what work he was doing. We do know that by the end, he was homeless in New York City. And his sister found him with the aid of a law enforcement official in Lamoille County who helped track Dave down. And so Dave arrives back in Vermont in early 1994, as Deanna described, with the clothes on his back and a toilet kit. And she and her husband sort of helped Dave get back on his feet, find him a little apartment. He's working at Cumbies, he's just working little odd jobs, one of which was as a sales clerk in Kaplan's department store in Morrisville. And I'll remind you of Ken Burnham from Hardwick Academy, who still lived in Hardwick, and he went shopping at Kaplan's one day. And he recognized the checkout clerk as Dave Morse, the man who used to cover their sporting events. And he said to Dave, you know, Ross Connolly at the Hardwick Gazette's looking for a sports writer. You should go talk to him. And I really believe that Dave had never thought he would become a sports writer again. I think he was just happy to be back in Vermont and back on his feet and near family. So it really was a wonderful coincidence that Ken came along that day. And then over the next 20 years, as you could tell from the beginning, Dave became this beloved figure in Hardwick because of what he did for the kids just in his writing and reporting, but also what he was doing behind the scenes. He just had an eye out for kids from difficult backgrounds that he went out of his way to help. He would help pay their way to basketball camps. He would connect them to college admissions officers if they were from homes where that wasn't really a primary interest. He would drive these kids to their basketball camps. And I think that packed auditorium that night reflected that love for him. And then a year later, his memorial service, the Hazen Gymnasium, was filled to overflowing. This is Dave and his Aunt Emma, Rex's widow, when he came back to Vermont. And she had given up all hope of ever seeing Dave again. This is Dave at the Village Restaurant in Hardwick, where the owner of the restaurant described their booths as being too small to fit all the people who wanted to come in and talk to Dave because it was his office away from his office. This was his paper. This was his column at the paper. And I confess, only recently did I realize that this is Morse Code D and this is Morse Code M for the Morse Code. And I'm a little embarrassed that I haven't known that for 20 years. This is Dave at the Hall of Fame induction ceremony for Carlton Fisk with a group of Hardwick kids, and this is just totally my saying I want this picture in the book because that's our son in the Red Sox cap.
Traitor.
Yeah, I had no control over that, sorry. This is Dave. Dave received a number of awards. Oh, I think we missed one. Yeah, there. So there's Dave at watching a Hazen basketball practice. Ryan Reno, a Hazen basketball alum, said that anytime Dave wandered in to watch practice, intensity level totally went up. So that the coach probably wished Dave were there every day. This is a group of Hardwick people accompanying Dave to Norwich University in the mid-2000s. They had a day in his honor. It was their annual media day, and they called it Dave Morse Day, and a bunch of people went down to join him that day. This is the Hazen Union Yearbook 2006 dedication to Dave, which he described as one of the greatest honors he was ever afforded. This is Tristan, this wonderful young man, great pitcher. So the Dimmick-Pantowski pitching matchup that you noticed a little while ago, Tristan led a very undermanned Hazen Union team to the state championship game. Another wild pitching duel that ended 1-0 on a couple of back-to-back doubles late in the game. So Tristan lost the game. But he and Dave bonded over their admiration and respect for Jackie Robinson. And Tristan always wore number 42. Jackie Robinson had played in the first game that Dave ever went to as a kid, and he always admired Jackie Robinson. He bought Tristan a book, a biography of Jackie Robinson, and Dave was just completely devastated when Tristan died. Dave, in his speech, mentioned looking up and seeing Timmy Shedd. Tim graduated from Hazen Union around 2000. He was a basketball superstar there, led the team to their first state championship in a long time, went on to play for 4 years at Norwich University, a connection that was really fostered by Dave. And Tim had traveled from North Carolina to be there that night to honor Dave. And he spoke the following year at Dave's memorial service. Dave talked about what Brittany had done. This is what Brittany did. Brittany was Hazen Union alum, captain of the soccer team, and this was a portrait of Dave. Note that he's very proudly sporting his Hazen Union championship basketball jacket. Dave had given up any pretense of being a middle-of-the-road sports reporter. He loved Hazen Union dearly and the kids there, and was happy to openly root for them. He was posthumously inducted into the Vermont Sports Hall of Fame, and this is his sister Deanna holding that plaque. She died about a year ago. I'm sad to say I would have loved her to have finally seen the book, but she was so behind this project, was a wonderful source of encouragement and stories, really loved her big brother. She would come with me on interviews because she wanted to hear about his childhood, stories that she didn't know. Just before finishing, I want to give a shout out to my wife for listening to this book read out loud dozens of times, to helping me polish this presentation as best as possible, and to our daughter for helping put all of this technology together that I'm pretty much at a loss to explain. I'm going to take you back to a couple of reflections by kids. I waited. The hardest people to get stories from were the recent Hazen or other high school area graduates. I think just because their lives are busy, they're starting careers and families. They would say to me again and again, "Yeah, I want to get back to you. Yeah, we'll have a meeting." And I knew the book would be so much less without their stories. And there were a couple that I'd virtually given up hope that I would ever hear from. One young man who lives in the Northwest in Seattle. And I had sent him follow-up emails, left him phone messages. And I woke up one morning, having gone to bed the night before with an empty email inbox. So he must have written to me when I was sound asleep and he was still awake on the West Coast. And this is what he wrote after years of me pestering him. "It is a tough endeavor, as I'm sure you are aware, to capture the story of a man who consistently made the story about everyone around him. Dave was always there, always. I don't mean that in any passive way. In truth, Dave's way of being present and supportive was possibly the most stark example of selflessness that I've had the privilege to experience. When you had a bad game or were generally struggling, he was there with encouraging words to lift your spirits, and when the opposite was true, he would celebrate your accomplishments. He was never the loudest voice in the stands or someone who would rush you at the end of the game, but he was always quietly there, attentive and supporting. He would always include the facts of the event, but never resorted to focusing on any individual failure. Even when things didn't go our way, he always focused on the positives, outstanding performances by opposing teams and players, outstanding performances that just came up short, displays of sportsmanship, etc. This was true in person as well. It's not uncommon for a high school athlete to have a rough game or series of games, and Dave was always there to listen to you and reassure you that you would overcome. I do not think there's a way for me to accurately state or even know the positive impact that knowing Dave has had on my life, but I know that it is significant. I truly could not have more respect or love for the man. He was a great and selfless friend, and he is dearly missed." And I was just blown away when I saw this email in the morning, and I texted back to him, "Thank you so much, this was wonderful." And then he wrote back another long email with this little story about, he was one of the kids that David helped get down to a summer basketball camp. And Hazen kids were good, they won some state titles, but you suddenly go to a basketball camp in Pennsylvania or in the Bronx, and there are going to be some kids with chops that you're going to have to play against. And Brad just described that he was struggling. The game felt really physical to him. He wasn't playing well. And he looked up, and there was Dave standing courtside, as Brad said, 10 hours from Hardwick. And he just wrote, "I can say with certainty that Dave showing up that weekend at a time when I felt lonely and discouraged and offering a friendly face and words of encouragement was more impactful than he will ever know." So the book ends with a few pages about two photographs. This one that you've seen before from a rare happy moment in his early childhood. And then this one, taken around 2010 or 12 at a wedding of one of the Hazen basketball alumni. And that's most of the basketball team of that era celebrating Dave in the middle of, in their midst at that celebration. And this is what I wrote about that moment. This is Dave actually describing, it's not me writing, this is Dave describing the event in the Hardwick Gazette in his Morse Code column. A reunion of one of Hazen Union's most glorious eras, primarily the 2000 group. This tale starts even 5 or 6 years before then. That's about my time frame here too. Mike Burnham and Xander Calderwood joined us for what I guess passes as a mash on the shore of the river. We are the Wildcats, mighty, mighty Wildcats, once a Wildcat, always a Wildcat. Someone took my camera. I indulged in dancing and high fives only. By now the band was playing, 6 hours after the exchanging of vows, ocean-going barges passing in the night up the St. Lawrence River, the lights of Prescott, Ontario on the other side. There's 17 to 18 years in 30 hours, and you're on your own again. David turned 75 in May of that year. For much of his life, love had proven an elusive presence. He had glimpsed it in childhood and at occasional holidays with siblings, nieces, and nephews through adulthood. At midlife, his wife had abruptly abandoned him, and he had passed the ensuing 2 decades mostly alone. Surely on that 2012 evening, he recognized that his life and work had made a difference in the lives of others, and he felt the love and caring, which he demonstrated for others for so many years, returned. Thank you.
Brendan, say more about Dave's response when you told him you were going to write a book about him.
He was pretty weak and frail, so, I obviously would have loved to have done it when he was more hale and hearty, and I would have learned so much of what I didn't know, or at least asked him. It's very interesting. I interviewed 100 or so people for this book from all stages of his life, and people all knew the same little bits of information. He clearly had he had a story to tell, and he would say, I was married, we had different lives, she went one way, I went the other, and it would end. And he would tell it in such a way perhaps to discourage follow-up questions, but these kids rode from Vermont to somewhere in Pennsylvania with him, and then he would sit at the diner and people trooped in and out, and have coffee with him over hours of conversation. I sat with him at many games, and it was interesting that he was very good for a man who built his life around pulling out conversation from other people, how closely guarded his own secrets were. And when I went to speak with him, he was dying, and I just said, I want to tell your story, and but we couldn't go a lot farther than that.
Did he agree to
Yeah.
you do that?
Yeah,
You asked for permission from him?
he nodded and said yes. Yeah. So anyone know anything I don't know?
Are his brothers still alive?
No, they've all died now. One had died before Dave did, and then the other two. Deanna was the last to die, and that was just in the last year or so. And her children are alive, and they helped with some of their memories from childhood of Dave visiting at Christmas. But he'd just appear. He didn't write a postcard or phone that I'm coming, I'll see you at Thanksgiving. He would just drive in and be there for a few days, and it was often at a time where he looked to be doing well. So I think some of those 20 years, he did have a good job and a reasonable income and a reasonable life, but it's not clear. There's some hints, and I talk about those, but it's a murky picture. And people who knew him in Vermont, sort of that whole sports reporting crew from all over the state who knew Dave really well from his decade at the Herald, had no idea where he was. And Tom Haley, whose name you might recognize from the Rutland Herald, he was a student intern. He was at Castleton and did student internship work for Dave when he was there. And he just describes doing flips when he heard Dave was back in Vermont. And Prudy Walsh, who wrote in the Connecticut River Valley for Claremont, or one of the New Hampshire side of the river papers, he and Dave traveled to spring training together. He said to me, I was probably his best friend and I didn't know shit about him. It was just, he just kept his secrets.
With that childhood, it was just a recipe for failure and disaster, and look at the accomplishment.
Yeah, and I really, at least I structure it I really feel those mentors through the years, ages 10 to 20, really set them on a path. And there's so many people I called who I was just given the names of, oh, you should talk to this person or that person. And, given the world we know today where horrible revelations are made about people we think of as those we honor, my heart was in my throat every time someone picked up the phone and I would say what I was. And from his childhood through his years at Hardwick, people just use the same terms. Even the guys on the track team at Waterbury High School just said he was kind, he was thoughtful, he looked after us, he never asked for anything himself, and just it seems that that's who he really was.
That's great of you to honor him like this.
It was burning a hole inside me, Andrew. I was bursting to tell this story.
Well done, Brendan.
Brendan, Anderson. Yeah.
I just would like to say that I'm not a sports fan at all. I'm an athlete, but I've never been interested in team sports. I've never read a sports section in my life. And this story is really compelling to me. And I've dipped in, read a few pages of it, but now I'm going to start at the beginning and read it all the way through.
Oh, good.
It's just done a fabulous job convincing me that this is a story of a person worth knowing.
Yeah.
And that's beautiful. I mean, I think that we don't do that enough in our world.
Yeah. Thank you, Becky.
Brendan, any responses yet from guys like Tim Shedd and Billy, the basketball coach?
No, I'm not sure the book's been out and around long. I mean, I've gotten a few very sweet emails, and a couple of the Hazen basketball kids who live locally, commented on Facebook and things that how fun it was to read, and but they were all. I didn't have to convince them that Dave was a wonderful person.
So, Brendan, it sounded like he lived alone the years he was in Hardwick.
Yeah, had his own little apartment. Yeah, he ate mostly at the diner. Lindell Richelieu runs the diner, and it's just this wonderful person who doesn't, there aren't enough hours in a day for her to fill with work. And she talks very passionately about watching Dave get iller and iller and iller and not asking for help. And that just harkens back to, I think, his childhood and this just disappearing, not wanting to be seen in need or struggling. And she just describes berating him, are you dying? What's going on? And then one day, he doesn't appear, and she goes across the street and practically kicks in his apartment door to, finally get him some assistance, but it was really too late at that point.
Cancer?
So yeah, it's just, as much as he felt the love in Hardwick, he never overcame that inability to share, or express a need for help.
And post Marietta, he never found romantic love.
Not that we know of, Jim. And maybe was there something in those other 20 years, but no, really. I mean, and he, when he would speak of his older life, it was always, I was married. And Marietta might not be easy to tell in the photographs, was actually a black woman. And so he would say, I was married to a black woman. She was a singer. It didn't work out. We went our separate ways. And actually, sadly, Rutland in the early 1970s, he got a lot of nasty phone calls and mail after he married Marietta. And even his Aunt Emma didn't want to go to the wedding because she was a black woman, which was sad.
Yeah.
And she clearly longed for Dave and was so thrilled when he returned to Vermont. But, yeah, so there were some, I think, deep emotional wounds that never fully healed.
Yeah.
But he still managed to contribute so much to all of those young lives.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Even if he wasn't sharing of himself, he was
Mhm.
giving. And
That was certainly his mission. And that's why I hope that he somehow felt that between the appreciation night and an event like that at the wedding where the kids are just celebrating who he was. And my daughter created a website for the book, BrendanBuckley-author.com, if you're curious, because the entire video of that appreciation night is on the website, and it is just classic small town America with coaches and parents and other journalists and the athletes themselves getting up, and Dave's sitting right there, and they're just saying thank you for what he did. So there was certainly that, he knew that he touched some souls.
Thank you, Brendan. It's the story we need.
Yeah.
Dr. Buckley, I know you won't do this because you're too modest, but my only suggestion, put the website in the last slide.
Talk to Helen.
What's wrong with it? The last slide, Pete. Last slide.
All right, okay.
just one. Okay.
Any other questions?